Hey guys, it's Mark, and I am Tooth from Tooth and Claw. I'd like to introduce my co-author, my good friend, and he is the Claw from Tooth and Claw. Hey, partner.
Hey, how are you?
All right, so let's just get into this, and I'll figure out how to bring up that picture anyway. So I'm going to let you have the floor.
It's interesting the topic of discussion we're having today. You
Yes.
have your Spitfire shirt on. I've got my Beaufighter shirt on.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting.
Very, very interesting. Claw's got his Beaufighter shirt on, and I got my Spitfire shirt on. I'm going to let you do the not so much the intro, but give the topic of conversation that we were having that we really got really into.
Okay, well, we were discussing part of the book that we're writing, Consequences Tim, in which Tim, the main character, flies Spitfires,
Right.
and his cousin that he finally meets during World War II flies Beaufighters for the RAF.
Right.
John, the cousin, has actually flown Spitfires but has transitioned over to the more powerful Beaufighter. There's a lot of animosity between Tooth and myself, between which is the better aircraft. It's become a bit of a joke and so forth.
Yes, it has become a bit of a joke.
But we were discussing just a little while ago actually having Beaufighters on aircraft carriers, the pros and the cons for such an aircraft.
Right.
There you go. There's the Beaufighter. And now this particular Beaufighter was used by the South African Air Force. As you can see, it's shooting rockets. They were equipped with rockets or torpedoes, not both. And it also had the 420mm guns sitting right under the nose of the cockpit there, plus a very odd arrangement of 6 303 machine guns, 4 in one side of the wing and 2 in the other wing on the other side, plus the 303 poking out the back for the gunner, radio operator, sitting in the back there to cover the rear of the aircraft.
Right, so it is a two-man crew.
Absolutely two-man crew, but it's a massive aircraft. We have pictures, Tooth will bring it up later on, of a Spitfire parked underneath a Beaufighter, just to give you the size and scale of it.
Right. In fact,
now, what we were discussing was the actual use of a Beaufighter on an aircraft carrier, being a torpedo bomber as it was, and what it can and can't do, all the different size, all the different issues with it being in twin-engined aircraft, the size of the aircraft, the weight of the aircraft and everything. Now, you've got to remember that this is an aircraft that is huge. What are you doing?
I switched over to the one that way you could see the torpedo.
Okay, you can see the background as well, that's all.
Oh, okay. That's a little
You have to make...
There you go.
Make the picture bigger. Yes, that's it. There you go. There you go. So as you can see with this picture, it's firing the 20mm cannons. It's also got the torpedo underneath it, and you can see that it's a twin-engine aircraft. Now, just down on the left-hand side, you can see the small 4 ports for the machine guns. On the other side, that's where the 2 ports were for the other side machine guns. They were arranged asymmetrically. And this is because when the aircraft fired those machine guns, it would push the wing that certain way. So with the propellers spinning in that direction, both in the same direction, you then actually counterbalance the firing of those machine guns. Now, we were discussing about the Beaufighter being a torpedo bomber being launched from aircraft carriers and recovered on aircraft carriers. Now, as you can see, these are huge aircraft. Very, very, very powerful engines. they don't actually have wings that fold. So the width of this aircraft is so big, it would not really fit on a deck of a carrier. It could land on the carrier, could take off from the carrier, but stowing it in the hangars. Now, you've got to remember that British aircraft carriers had 2 decks of hangars, an upper and a lower deck, and they were armoured, very different from the Japanese and the American carriers that had just one large hangar deck.
Right.
The British carriers actually had 2 hangar decks. Now, the height of these is restrictive on a carrier, but we were discussing the possibility of actually having a Beaufighter on an aircraft carrier. What would we need? What would we have to do to make it compatible? So the first things we're looking at is folding those wings. So, hello, Kat.
Yes, I'm sorry about that, but she's doing her thing. So
just for people's knowledge, this cat, every time we chat, this cat has to get in on the conversation.
Yes, very much so.
Please enlighten everyone as to the cat's name.
The cat's name is Captain.
Very fitting for the topic.
Yes, she actually walked in pregnant and gave birth to a litter of 5 boys, and I found homes for each and every single one of them. And she has been fixed, so in case she plans an escape, she's not coming back pregnant again. So the interesting thing was, and again, because Claw has got the Beaufighter shirt on, and I've got the Spitfire shirt on, the one character flies Spitfires, the other character flies Beaufighters, and it was we had always planned for a like a friendly rivalry between these 2 characters, but this was more of a the Beaufighter pilot coming up with an idea, and the Spitfire pilot literally like going, well, okay, maybe this might work, but what about if we did this, and what if we did that? They literally put their heads together to try to come up with a plan to like make carrier-based Beaufighters. What would it take? How many Beaufighters would you need versus like how many fighters would you need? Because if they're carrying torpedoes, they need fighter cover. A Beaufighter versus a Japanese Zero, for example, would really not work well. So the Beaufighter would really need fighter cover to be able to do its job.
To give further context here, the Spitfire pilot in our story actually started out as a Navy carrier pilot in the US Navy, flying Dauntless dive bombers.
We're just going to
have this is where they actually put their heads together. The Beaufighter pilot comes up and says, hey, you were a Navy pilot. What would we need to do this to this aircraft? So first things first, as I said, we need to look at folding the wings because we need to reduce that footprint on the carrier so we can stick more on there. Another thing we'd need to do is we'd need to introduce some hydraulics to lower the nose of the aircraft so that it could actually fit into the carrier's hangar.
Right.
So, and then they have to pump up when they get it up on deck, they fold it out, they have to pump it up so that they could actually put the torpedo underneath.
Right. And that was kind of a thing, as having the knowledge that you have, conceivably, how conceivable is this idea?
Well, given that war produces many interesting ideas, it's not too far-fetched that they would think of something like this. I mean, towards the end of the war, they actually had a single-seat version of the Mosquito called the Hornice, which actually flew from carriers. It just missed the war because of production and so forth. But it's not within the realms of impossibility The British, this idea all stemmed from an idea that you and I had, and I asked you to look up a certain other aircraft.
Right.
The Grumman Avenger, which is an American torpedo bomber, was used by the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm to basically do the role of what we're talking about here with the Beaufighter.
Right.
Now, in the British service, the Avenger was called the Tarpon bomber. Now, the difference between the Tarpon and the Avenger was there was a lot of different electronics fitted into the aircraft, but the British took away the torpedo carrying capability of the Avenger and changed it into an actual bomber. Right. And it used to fit 4 500-pound bombs, which that was a very big load back then. 2,000-pound bomb. That puts it in the class of a medium bomber for that time.
Right.
So you've got this 3-person aircraft. You've got the pilot, the turret operator, and there was a third person who was what we call the wireless operator, but he also operated the ventral gun underneath. And he also had a periscope so that he could look down, see the bomb bay, make sure it's open and so forth, make sure that all the bombs dropped and everything. And then looking out through the plexiglass where his gun was, he could see if the bombs hit target or not.
Okay.
The Beaufighter was actually a 2-person aircraft, as you can see in this picture. You've got the pilot and you've got the bubble behind, which actually contained the radio operator, who was also an air gunner at the back.
Right. So my question to you, and again, this is something that we didn't touch on, but I think you're going to know quite a bit about. Replace the torpedo with rockets. How much damage would it do? I mean, I know how much damage it would do to like a merchant vessels, but what about military vessels?
Okay, well, torpedoes were used mainly to go after capital ships, big vessels. If you put the rockets on, you've got that other picture there with the rockets.
Yeah.
So these rockets, they're 8-inch rockets, and they've got a very explosive head on them. If memory serves, it was about 25 pounds worth of explosives in the head of the rocket. Right. Now, these shooting against, say, a frigate or a destroyer, a couple of those, well, one salvo of those would be enough to damage most of it if it hit in the right spot. If you hit the turrets where the guns were, if you hit the pilot house, the wheelhouse, if you hit the radio, or even if you got a fluke shot and hit the engine room,
right,
you would basically put that whole ship out of commission. If you hit one of the turrets just below where the magazine is, that ship would explode and be out of commission straight away.
Okay, so what about the possibility of actually carrying bombs? Is that even feasible or no?
The Beaufighter never, ever, ever carried bombs. Not in the entire history of the Beaufighter.
Okay.
It's not to say that it couldn't.
Okay.
I mean, if it could carry a torpedo, they could rig it up to carry 500-pound bombs and so forth, but they wouldn't be internal. They'd be external. Now, the other thing is that when you have ordnance outside, it places drag on the aircraft. Torpedoes, as you could see, they are fairly streamlined. The rockets are extremely streamlined. Bombs are not streamlined.
Right.
Carrying bombs externally reduces your range by a factor of at least 25%.
Okay.
So a carrier would have to be within 200 miles, say, before launching a Beaufighter with bombs.
Okay. So it severely cut down its range.
Severely, yes. Now, the Beaufighter had a very, very, very large range. It could fly from England to Paris, and then back again without even emptying a tank.
Wow.
It was a massive aircraft it had, and you can see those big radial engines. Two of those give it a lot of power. Unlike the Spitfire had a very good power ratio, but it was a tiny aircraft with an inline engine, and it was liquid cooled. Radial engines, having the airflow go through it, keeps it cool. Now, they did experiments with Merlin engines, the Mark IV Beaufighter, two Merlin engines, but they were worried about the Merlin engines running out because they needed them for the Spitfires, they needed them for the Lancasters and various other aircraft. So they just stuck with the original engines, and these engines were so powerful. One engine alone would easily power probably 3 Spitfires. That's how much power it had in it.
Right.
And the reason it had so much power is it's got to lift this aircraft, fully weighted aircraft, off the airfield, the hangar, not the hangar, the flight deck. So it's got a lot of fuel. It's got a lot of ammunition because the 20 mils alone weighed very heavily. One 20 millimeter cannon would be probably one entire rack of those rockets that you can see there.
Right.
That's how heavy they were.
Right. So theoretically, positioned in the Pacific, what were some of the enemy ports that were by Australia that will be within range of a carrier fleet?
Well, you've got a lot of enemy action. Like you've got Guadalcanal, these days known as the Solomon Islands. So the Japanese had Guadalcanal, which was in range of most of Papua New Guinea.
Right.
Now, Australia had Papua New Guinea, most of Papua New Guinea. At the time we're talking, which is mid-1942, the Japanese had pretty much gotten to the Owen Stanley Ranges, which is the main mountain range that divides the middle of Papua New Guinea north to south.
Right.
Now, these mountain ranges are over 10,000 meters high.
Wow.
So looking at the Beaufighter had a maximum service ceiling of 18,000 feet. So that gives you 8,000 feet above the Owen Stanley Ranges.
Yeah.
Now, the Zeros could easily take out the Beaufighter because they can climb much higher.
Right.
So, as you were saying, they needed fighter escort.
Right. But I was thinking, I believe it was Truck or whatever, the island with the
Truck. Yeah.
Yeah.
Truck was Japan's Pearl Harbor.
Right, but it also would be, because the thing is, there's no place for the ships to go. You know, they're anchored. You know, and unless you have torpedo nets out, you know, all you have to do is just get a couple of good shots, and you're taking down capital ships like crazy. You know,
exactly.
So
you can insert a picture later on of Truck, the port of Truck and everything, and you can actually see when you look at the picture of Truck, there are certain ports of entry. If you can only get into Truck, which is a little lagoon basically,
right,
in certain areas. There's one to the northwest, there's one to the southeast. That's it. And you usually had, the Japanese usually had patrol boats in those areas plus submarines just guarding those entrances. Not to say that you couldn't get in there, but with Beaufighters and that, if you park a carrier, say 300 nautical miles outside that area, you're going to basically sink those ships in port.
All right, I have definitely got to move this up. Whoops. Okay, there we go. I figured it would be most simplistic because that way you could kind of see the way the reef was and stuff like that. You know.
Yeah. So this map is actually very interesting because it shows not only the little passageways that could get into there, but most of these passageways were not capable of taking carriers and capital ships, battleships, because they're too narrow and too shallow.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's Lemon Pass over on the left-hand side there, the top one on the left-hand side.
Yes, Lemon Pass.
And Northeast Pass. Those two are the only ones that were able to take the capital ships. The other ones were just too narrow and too shallow. So, and you can see where the anchorage is.
Mm-hmm.
So, very interesting area. Now, this map also shows the direction of the American aircraft when they attacked Truk.
Right.
It came in from that direction. That's all well and good, but that would be where they were expecting the attack to come from. And this is why it was important for the Americans to take out as many capital ships as possible, so they could actually allow the aircraft to get in there and do the damage that they needed to do.
Right.
If I was planning a raid on Truk, I would have the main fleet where the aircraft are coming from, the American aircraft are coming from, but I would also have two other aircrafts, batteries coming in. I would have one coming in from the east, over where Anchorage is, coming in from that way, and I would also have one coming up from where the signed Truk is, coming up from the top there, down towards the islands. And that means having a minimum of 6 aircraft carriers. So you have one aircraft carrier off the Anchorage side, off the east coast, one aircraft carrier coming in from the northeast, the northwest, and then from the southwest you have the main force coming in.
Right. So, it kind of seems that especially with the like the Doolittle raid, that these two characters would be like, this can be done.
Yeah.
You know, we can do this. All we need to do is to come up with some, logistic answers, answers to some logistic problems. The wings, for example, and stuff like that. Knowing Beaufighters the way you do, and knowing that in consequences, Tim, that Tim is a dive bomber pilot, what is the possibility of a Beaufighter being used as a dive bomber? Is it conceivable?
Not
or no?
possible at all. Not possible at all.
Okay.
The way that the Beaufighter was actually, it was built very sturdily and so forth, but dive bombers are a completely different kettle of fish.
Okay.
They actually have dive brakes.
How about that?
Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect. Now, a Beaufighter could not be a dive bomber. This is a Dauntless dive bomber. Now, see those speed brakes, how they're extended?
Yes.
Okay, that's to help it maintain control.
Mm-hmm.
Being in a dive, a 90-degree dive like it is, you have so much stress on the airframe. These things were built so that it could take that stress.
Okay.
These things could take anywhere up to 12 Gs in stress. Normal aircraft, even the Beaufighter or the Spitfire, in a dive would not be able to handle this stress.
Right.
If memory serves, the Spitfire could max out at probably about 8 Gs.
Okay.
The Beaufighter couldn't do that. It could max out at about 6 Gs.
Okay.
It's just the way that they built the aircraft, and the materials that they used. The British were not very big on dive bombers. They did have one dive bomber, but it wasn't very successful. And it was actually a counterpart to the Hawker Hurricane. It was developed from the Hawker Hurricane. And as I said, it wasn't very, very big. It wasn't very useful to them. They didn't explore the use of dive bombers.
Right.
They had a couple of Navy dive bombers, the Skua and the Rock, but those were absolutely garbage.
Right. And a lot of things that, and Jay Claw was the one who basically had to teach me this. When you watch American World War II movies, you see the Bismarck, you see the Hood, you see the Prince of Wales. You never see a carrier. So I was under the assumption, well, the Germans didn't have a carrier, so the British didn't have a carrier, only the Americans, Japanese. And he's looking at me like, you can't be that naive, and I'm like, were there? And I was like, yeah, Mark, there were. It's the Navy, the Royal Navy equivalent to the Spitfire was called the Seafire. They very much had carriers, and like you said, they were built differently than the Japanese and the Americans because they had the two decks. So it's kind of interesting simply because in the story, this would be kind of groundbreaking. This would be kind of, in a way, revolutionary, simply because you're using a large aircraft for the purpose of either being a torpedo bomber or having the rockets or whatever. But because as long as it had the fighter cover, it could do some damage. It could absolutely do some damage. It's just a matter of, like I said, in the book, these two characters getting together and coming, ironing out the logistics, ironing out the problem. And being that one was in the Navy, it was like, we can solve the wing problem. You're taking up too much space. The wings have got to fold. Where can we fold the wings? And I think even like the Japanese Zero, I think the wings were folded at the ends, weren't they?
Yeah, the tips were folded, yes.
Yeah.
It reduced the size of the aircraft on the deck by 3 feet, I think it was, each side. Excuse me. But, yeah. Americans... Excuse me.
I had the same problem just a few minutes ago. It's okay.
Yeah. Very annoying. Very annoying. Pardon me. The Americans were actually the pioneers of folding wing aircraft for Navy carriers. And that came about with the Wildcat in the F4 version.
Right.
What they actually did was they released a few locks and the wings folded flush against the side of the aircraft. And they were able to fit more aircraft on the carrier by doing this.
Right.
You have to understand that with aircraft on carriers, minimizing the space that they take up allows you to have more aircraft on the carrier in more different roles.
Right.
And moving those aircraft around is actually very much like ballet. You dance these aircraft here, there, and everywhere.
Right.
You have to place. You've got aircraft that need surfacing. So what you do is you place them towards the back of the aircraft carrier to go down on the aft lift so that the workshops can work on those. Meanwhile, all your really good aircraft, which are still intact, ready to go and all that, you put them at the forward elevator towards the front of the ship so that they could go up, shoot off, everyone's happy. Meanwhile, those aircraft that are getting worked on, once they're finished, then move to the middle so that they're ready for the next deployment.
Right. So you use your imagination. Okay. Um,
So you want me to dive into your realm?
yes. How many Beaufighters do you think a British aircraft carrier could have, provided that it had a complement of fighters?
Just given the size of the aircraft, you probably have up to 18 Beaufighters.
Okay,
But that, as I mentioned before, the size of it is easily about 3 Spitfires.
right. And I'm actually going to look for that one picture really quick, because it's kind of interesting. Where is it? Simply because I'm not sure how many planes a British carrier could take, but I really do think
The largest British carrier could take 86 aircraft.
okay.
So that was the largest one.
Mm-hmm.
They averaged about 68 aircraft. So having 18, you're reducing that complement by basically 2/3.
Wow.
You're taking 1/3 of those aircraft off to put in 18 Beaufighters.
Now, how long did it take to get a squadron of fighters launched back in World War II?
A well-trained crew, I'm trying to remember now, a well-trained crew launching a strike, let's say for instance, the strike against the Bismarck, using Fairy Swordfish, which is a biplane used by the RN back then.
Right.
A well-trained crew could get the entire complement of Swordfish in the air, say, half an hour.
Okay.
Yeah. A well-trained crew can actually launch, there it is. So you can see clearly the size difference between the Beaufighter and the Spitfire. The Beaufighter is a massive aircraft.
Right. Compared to the Spitfire, it dwarfs the Spitfire. It just absolutely dwarfs the Spitfire. And that's kind of the thing, because
Just for the viewers' information, right where the Spitfire's tail is, if you look to the right of that, there's a hatch there. That's the entry hatch to get into the Beaufighter.
Okay, so that would be right
there.
Yeah.
Right there, you can see it. So that's the entry hatch to get to the inside the plane. Now, the pilot could enter through the windshield. It had a slide back canopy.
Right here.
The guy in the back, the bubble canopy tilted to one side. Although, if there was a gun inside there, it didn't tilt. They actually welded it shut because you can't move the gun. So everyone had to go through the hatch.
Okay, so it wasn't a situation like with the Dauntless where the 50 calibers you pull them out.
No.
Okay, so it wasn't that situation at all. Okay.
No. So the rear gun actually was fixed in position, firing through the plexiglass. And if the aircraft did a belly landing and you've got a gun in the back, basically what would happen would the guy in the back would basically shove the gun out the blister. The aircraft would land. This is so that he didn't bash his head on it when the aircraft hit the ground.
So
the guy would then have to run through the middle of the aircraft, get to the cockpit, and climb out the cockpit.
Right. So given the dimensions of the aircraft and what you know about the Beaufighter, it would be able to take off and land on a carrier
easily. If a B-25 can do it, a Beaufighter could do it far better.
Sorry about that.
Interesting.
Please say that again.
If a B-25 could take off from a carrier, a Beaufighter could do it much better.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, it's got those huge, powerful engines.
Right.
So you could launch. The B-25 needed 425 feet to launch. The Beaufighter could do it in about 350.
Okay.
That's with the carrier heading straight into the wind, the wind coming over the deck, and the engines powered up to full.
Right. So it wouldn't be a situation, would it, whereby you raise a Beaufighter up from the lift, the Beaufighter takes off, and then you raise another Beaufighter up?
No, you'd actually have them all up on deck before launching. Okay. Because remember, you've got to unfold the wings. And as you can see here, it's a very, very high position.
Right.
They're very tall. Now, this is what I was saying about pneumatics. You'd need a way to lower the aircraft so that it could fit better into the hangar.
Right.
Then they'd have to raise it when it got up on deck so that they could load it with the torpedo or load it with the rockets or anything.
Mm-hmm. So
folding the wings would be exactly the same. You'd have to raise the aircraft before you could unfold the wings.
So, and you're referring to unfolding the wings like that one, like the Wildcat, correct?
Yes.
Literally, like have them flushed against the body of the aircraft.
Yes. Well, it wouldn't fit flush against the aircraft because you've got the engines. You wouldn't be able to go any closer to the fuselage because of those engines. So you'd actually have to take the folding point just outside of those engines.
Okay.
So it's pretty much still the same width as a Spitfire's wingspan, unfolded.
Right. But it does provide that extra punch. I mean, if this actually was something that was done, I think it would have added an extra chapter to what the Beaufighter was capable of. You know?
Absolutely, there's no doubt about that. A sea Beaufighter, because the Royal Navy put sea in front of everything just so that they could establish it was a Navy version. A sea Beaufighter would add so much firepower towards its forces.
Right.
Fighting the enemy with a sea Beaufighter, they could transport that. And you mentioned when we were having our conversation, the Mediterranean. These things would not be in the Mediterranean at all because it's too constrictive.
Right.
And the targets in the Mediterranean were basically patrol boats.
Mm-hmm.
So these things would be deployed in the Pacific most definitely against Japanese capital ships, a bit against commerce raiders. The Indian Ocean definitely because of commerce raiders. You've got the Emden. No, sorry, not the Emden, the Cormoran, which attacked Australian vessels off Western Australia. They would also be very prevalent up in the Atlantic, the Northern Atlantic, because even with rockets, these things could take out a submarine.
And that's kind of interesting. Can you expand on that at least a little bit? I mean, would the submarine have to be on the surface or?
Well, most submarines during World War II actually did travel on the surface, despite what you see in movies and so forth. They only dived basically when they were going to attack something.
Mm-hmm.
They never transited the entire time because it was too much strain on the batteries.
Right.
So they were diesel powered. They'd be chugging away on the surface and everything. Then they would see something that would cause them to dive. Either they'd see a plane in the air, they'd say, right, we've got to get out of here, otherwise we're going to get hurt. Or they would see ships that they want to attack. Okay, we're going to dive, we're going to sneak attack them.
Right. So instead of doing a coastal thing, actually, and still having them on an aircraft carrier, that would severely constrict their hunting, their patrol areas, the submarines' patrol areas.
Well, having the Beaufighter in a hunting capacity off an aircraft carrier, they wouldn't have needed basically that huge big gap that they had because of the range of the Beaufighter. The range was incredible.
Right.
Because of the range of the Beaufighter, they could actually fly 2 or 3 of them in a pattern looking for submarines. They'd be armed with the rockets. If they did see a submarine, they could call in, make sure that the fleet knew exactly where it was, and then they could go in and strike it with the rockets, basically damaging it, if not taking it out completely.
Right.
So they would have benefited greatly from a sea Beaufighter at the time.
If we had sea Beaufighters, okay,
Mm-hmm.
how much would that have changed convoy duty for merchant shipping, or for the merchant marines, for the merchant shippers, for the merchant ships that were going back and forth from England to the United States or Canada?
It would have changed it quite a lot, actually, and you're missing Russia, merchant ships going to Russia as well.
True.
It would have changed the operation of convoy duties quite a lot. You probably find that with the sea Beaufighters, escort ships there would have been a lot less of them.
Mm-hmm.
Attacks would have happened more of a night time than what they did any time.
Right.
Because they didn't actually have a decent radar at the time to detect surface vessels. That came later on in the war,
Right.
but they still weren't able to pinpoint a periscope like what they can today.
Right. So
it would have changed the operating procedures quite a lot.
now I know that the submarine pens that the Germans have made in France were virtually impenetrable. I do realize that, but literally a submarine leaving French waters heading out to sea would be easy pickings, because of the range of a Beaufighter.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that it's such a spectacular idea to, for these two characters, because it not only do they play off each other, because they play off each other's strengths, because the one cousin is a Beaufighter pilot, although he was at one particular point a Spitfire pilot, but the other one has got the Navy aspect to it and can answer like all those questions. And it's to the point where literally they can like, we can make this work, we can make this happen,
Yeah.
So it's kind of like brainstorming. I kind of visualize these characters at a pub, and because they work at different times, and mostly, as you said, Beaufighters were nighttime fighters. Literally, they're getting in, they're meeting at a pub. One's having breakfast, the other's having dinner, and they're talking. All right, we got an hour. Let's try to hammer this detail out,
Yeah.
And it's kind of one of those things that, it doesn't take 5 minutes, but it's something they would work on for weeks, and then take it to the next step in the story. Is there anything more you want to add, or?
Well, basically, the Seafire had its purpose.
Mm-hmm.
It was a fighter.
Yeah.
during the convoy days, the early convoy days, they developed MAC ships, merchant armed aircraft carriers. These had basically between 4 and 8 fighters on board.
Right.
They didn't have any hangar storage or anything. They were basically there on the deck. Having a Seabo fighter on a MAC ship would be very interesting. You'd have 2 on a MAC ship with 2 fighters. That's about it.
Okay.
And that's with the larger ones.
Right.
You wouldn't be able to put a Seabo fighter on the smaller MAC ships.
Okay. Give me a second. I want to pull something up because I do want to ask you a question. I don't mean to cut you off or anything like that, but I do have a question for you. And just let me know when I can pop that question.
Anytime you're ready.
Okay. Now with rockets, I mean, you've got the torpedoes. We know that they can launch torpedoes. We also got rockets. Once you know submarines, all right, rockets could do damage to a submarine, correct?
They could actually take it out.
Okay, so question for you. What's the range you would need to effectively use rockets versus the range you would need to effectively use a torpedo?
Okay, 2 different tactics altogether.
Which I do realize, but I want to give you the floor.
Okay. Using a torpedo, you launch the torpedo probably about 250 yards out.
Okay.
You'd have to be very, very low, and you'd have to fly at a specific speed so that when you launch the torpedo, it penetrates the water and doesn't break up. Now, too fast, it's going to hit the water and break up or explode, because water is like a brick wall when you hit it first at such a speed.
Right. Too
slow, and the torpedo will run out of fuel before it actually gets to its target. That then allows the enemy to capture that torpedo, work it out, and use it against you. Now, rockets, as you can see here, he's pretty much flying level and so forth, but you could use rockets at any angle. So you could come in at a 65-degree angle,
right,
adding more kinetic energy to the explosive head.
Okay.
So it's coming down at, say, 800 miles an hour. Adding the kinetic energy of the free fall, it's actually going to go through the deck.
Right.
And explode inside.
Yeah. Now, for the submarines at the time, were they kind of armored or no? I mean, how
really.
thick was the hull?
The thickness varied on the submarine, the way it was built and so forth. There were so many different variables. But roughly, you're looking at about 3 inches thick.
Okay.
Not very thick at all. And this is why they had such shallow dive depths.
Right.
They were also single-hulled. Today, all vessels traveling the oceans have to be double-hulled. That's maritime law.
Right.
A single-hull ship, like a submarine, the vessels of the day, once you penetrate that armor, you're exposing everything inside through not only the hull inside, but the explosion that rips out. You're exposing everything inside. Now, a salvo of rockets, like you can see here, we've got 4 rockets on each wing.
Right.
A salvo of rockets launched against a Type 7C submarine used by the German Navy at the time would actually blow it up.
Wow. Now, were these rockets, when you fired the rockets, were they fired all at the same time or one at a time? Or
that's another interesting thing. Now, the pilot could select full salvo or individual rockets.
Okay.
Now, individual rockets, it's not firing one at a time. It's firing one pair at a time.
Okay.
So
one from the left side, one from the right side.
yeah.
Okay.
And the reason they did that was symmetrical flight.
Right.
When you alter the flight characteristics of an aircraft, so say if you've got an engine out, the entire plane slews to that side. So basically, you've got the power of that engine pushing you. Okay, this engine goes out.
Right.
This engine keeps going.
Mm-hmm.
It starts pushing the aircraft that way. So you're fighting to get it that way to keep it flying straight.
Right.
Same thing with firing rockets. If you fire or any ordnance whatsoever, you get rid of ordnance in an asymmetrical flight. You have to then fight in the other direction to keep the plane flying straight.
Okay.
And that's still indicative today with like the Hornets, the Falcons, and so forth when they drop their ordnance. They fire something, they've got to counterbalance that so that they can still fly straight.
Mm. Okay. So what I'm envisioning, because we know the term wolf pack, and we know that the Germans used the wolf packs. Imagine even 3 bullfighters on patrol coming across a wolf pack. The kind of damage that they could do.
If they could do it. Okay.
Yeah.
You got to remember that wolf packs are very cagey.
Mm.
So as I mentioned before, they were all on the surface at certain times.
Right.
And it was only when they spotted something that they would dive.
Right.
Now, 3 sea Beaufighters flying around spotting a wolf pack, they would have to break off to do maximum damage. They could probably target 1, maybe 2 of those submarines at a time.
Right, but they could also give out their location and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Forcing the Germans to change direction.
Right. And to your knowledge, and this is something you may or may not know, how big were the wolf packs?
They varied in size. Usually around 6, but there were recorded cases of anywhere up to 20 submarines in a wolf pack.
Wow.
And that was very early on in the war when they had free reign.
Yeah.
But yeah, it depends on the target that they're going for and so forth. Like, if they're going after a carrier or a battleship group, they would throw more submarines into it.
Right.
Whereas if they were going after a convoy, well, convoys are very slow, very disorganized and so forth. So they would use the minimal amount but get the maximum amount of damage over time.
Right.
And the other thing you got to remember is that wolf packs operated with a supply ship. So whilst the German submarines are going around and so forth, looking for their targets, their supply ship is anchored in one particular place. They would go off, do their patrol, and then they would come back to that supply ship. They would get their provisions, they would get some fuel. Sometimes, I'm not too sure about this, but sometimes they would offload a couple of torpedoes on if they needed torpedoes.
Right.
These supply ships were very, very, very high-valued targets.
I can imagine.
There's actually a case of one in Spain that was taken out.
Uh-huh.
The Spanish government, being good fellows with the Nazis, the Spanish government put in a huge big protest about a Nazi supply ship being taken out in its territorial waters. The British turned around and said it was a valuable target. It was necessary to take it out because it was inflicting war damage.
Mm-hmm. So these supply ships could be out in the open ocean, and if they just happen to come across a sea Beaufighter, and you take it out because, I mean, obviously it's going to be stationary when it gets spotted, and if you realize it's going to be spotted, it's not going to stay stationary. But
it's not necessarily stationary. They would fly a pattern. They would patrol in a pattern.
Right.
They would basically go in a little circle and so forth. But the other thing is, and the Nazis were very famous for doing this, they would actually flag their vessels as another nation's vessel.
Ah, okay.
So a supply ship would actually fly under the Dutch flag. And the Dutch were actually neutral after they got taken out by the Germans. Or in the early wars, they were actually allies. They were allies of the British.
Mm-hmm.
So taking out a supply ship for submarines is a very controversial issue because what flag was it flying under? How do you know? You've got onus of proof of it being a legitimate target. If you cannot prove that it was a legitimate target, then you've got no idea on what you're doing. The only way you could know that it was a supply ship is if you catch it with a submarine docked beside it.
I was about to say, I was just about to say that. You know, literally, you would have to catch it with a submarine. Wow. So it's kind of interesting simply because this, I don't want to say it could have shortened the war, but it could have changed certain aspects of warfare.
Absolutely.
You know, it could have changed certain aspects of warfare just by putting a Beaufighter on a carrier and making it a sea Beaufighter. You know, literally having that range, especially for convoy duty. You know, literally you could go out. What did you say? It was like 1,500 miles or something like that? Or
1,500 miles.
You know, that's 700 miles out and. Well, 750 miles out, 750 miles back.
Yeah.
But
as I said, that negates the gaps.
That's what I'm saying. It's a long way from your carrier, and it's kind of like you're not going to be able to find your carrier. You know, the enemy is not. If it sees a sea Beaufighter, it's going to be like, all right, we're screwed. But where's the carrier? It's like the carrier is nowhere near this aircraft. You know.
Yeah. So basically, short-term answer is that it would have changed warfare quite a lot in the early days.
Mm-hmm.
So mid-war, things changed because American aircraft got sent over for the English to use. The English did this, that, and all the rest to it, and changed it. Some of the changes the British did to American aircraft actually ruined it. Mm-hmm. The P-38 Lightning is a classic example there. Some improvements that they made actually enhanced it, and that's the Tarpon bomber.
Right.
So it boils down to the needs of the service.
Right.
But having a sea Beaufighter would have changed warfare quite a lot.
So I think we got a really interesting idea here. And, you know, as
if only we'd been born back in World War II to have this idea.
Well, I just I can visualize intense discussions between the two characters.
Yes.
You know, especially about like solving the wing issue.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and
another change you'd have to make is strengthening the lower airframe so that you could put that arrestor hook on it.
Good point. You know, so, and you know, it would require just a little bit of training to learn how to land on an aircraft carrier because you need the arrestor hook. You know.
Yeah.
Question for you, and I don't know if this changes anything or not because you discussed power earlier. If you thought a sea Beaufighter missed the arrestor hook, would the pilot be able to power up in time to be able to do a flyby? In other words, to
Absolutely.
go around
Absolutely.
so there wouldn't be like the old newsreels where somebody missed the arrestor hook and went over the side.
Again, it depends on the training of the pilot.
Mm.
Okay. Now, there were World War II. There are a lot of footage, images showing planes going overboard and so forth. That's because the training just wasn't there. People were getting shot out of the skies, and they'd bring in these rookies with minimal training. We learnt previously that Spitfire pilots only had 10 hours worth of flying before they went up on their own.
Right.
You know, imagine a Beaufighter with 10 hours.
Yeah, no, I don't.
Exactly. You wouldn't be able to do it. You'd need a minimum of 50 hours. Minimum.
Right.
But war turns around and says, no, you can't have 50 hours. I'm going to take this anyway.
Right.
So you have a lot of intense training before you have a Beaufighter operating off carrier decks.
Right. Well, I have nothing else I want to add at this time. Do you have any more that you want to add?
That's about it.
All right. So I'm Tooth. He's Claw. And I want to thank you guys for watching this video. If you guys like this video, by all means, hit like, hit that subscribe, and leave a comment. Let me know what you guys think of our idea. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.